Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series. As always, I am your host, constant reader, Sister Scott.
And I'm inconstant reader, Sister Matt.
This week on the show, we take a look at the Stephen King short story featuring our very own Roland. We're going to be talking about the Little Sisters of Eluria. And I think, for the first time on this show ever, we're starting and finishing a story in the same week. That's not happened.
That's true. It feels weird. It feels weird. I can't tell if we're going to talk for like 45 minutes or if we're going to talk for like 3 hours because my calibration's all whack.
Well, I think if you know anything about us, it's probably closer to the 3-hour mark. But Matt, before we get into the story, why don't you tell me what you thought of the Little Sisters of Eluria as a whole?
It's a great little short story. We're returning to Roland, but it's a younger Roland. We get to see a lot of our Dark Tower sort of touchstones, a lot of story moments that feel very much of a piece with the Dark Tower, and yet this is this completely separate little story off to the side. And on the whole, I'm very glad that this exists. It's really neat, and it kind of it pursues the plot line that it pursues. I think is different from anything that we've seen in the Dark Tower too. So.
Yeah, it is. I think you're absolutely right that it feels a piece of Dark Tower while also feeling really distinct and unique. This is only the second time I've read this thing, actually. I read it once, and really I had not read it in a while. I did not remember too much of what this was, so not a first time read for me, but I'm way closer to being in your shoes for this one than I have on anything else that we've done.
Well, I think we're probably very much in the same shoes here, actually, because I actually read this story in perhaps literally 1998 when it came out.
It's so crazy.
And I had almost entirely forgotten it, except for the ejaculation part. Okay, that's kind of a joke. I remembered the beginning of the story a lot better than the ending, which was actually kind of nice because as I was reading it this time, I at a certain point I was like, I don't actually remember where this goes from here.
Yeah.
And so that made it more exciting for me.
Cool. All right, so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that story. But first, before we get into it, we do have a couple of pretty important announcements to go over real quick. First, if you are listening to the show the day it came out on Thursday, the 13th? No, the 15th. Jesus. On Thursday, April 15th, our new episode of our Patreon-only bonus podcast, Other Levels of the Tower, came out yesterday on the 14th. It had Matt and I taking a look at the 1984 adaptation of Children of the Corn. That was a fun episode to record. I really, really had fun talking and lambasting that movie with you, Matt. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, just such a complexly awful movie.
Yeah, so if you are a patron at our $10 level and above, you should see that already, and hopefully you've listened to it already. If not, this would be a really great time to pledge up, and you get a great episode. And then I think this is like the 6th one we've done of these, so there's a lot on there now. Yeah,
there's quite a backlog of other levels of the tower. So yeah, don't miss out on it. You can check out me and Scott talking about a whole bunch of King adaptations if you upgrade to that level.
A whole bunch of bad King adaptations is what we're getting at.
I mean, 1 or 2 good ones in there, yes, for sure. But yeah. The pattern is emerging. That's true.
I think we've been half and half because we've covered Stand By Me, which was good. We've covered Misery, which was good.
Right.
Then we covered The Langoliers, which was not. We covered Carrie, which was really good.
Yeah.
Maybe we have done more good ones than bad ones.
I think
we did Needful Things, which was not good.
Langoliers, Needful Things, and this movie are definitely the 3 bad ones.
Yeah. So, I think that fits the King adaptations in general. There's some pretty good movies out there. There's a lot of bad ones.
Yeah, and next we're going to be doing Dreamcatcher. Just
yes,
FYI.
Which we might be split on. I don't know. We'll see. It's a whole month away, but I'm really, really looking forward to that one.
Yeah, me too.
All right, our other quick announcement before we get into the episode proper is we've got our finale coming up in a couple weeks. Next week, we're going to be talking about the Dark Tower movie. And then the week after that, I put on the schedule finale. And when I put that on the schedule, I didn't actually have a plan for what that means. I think we've already done a Dark Tower finale thing already, But at the same time, this is us finishing the project, basically. We're not done with the podcast, but we're finishing the original goal of the project. It's over. So I feel like we should celebrate that in some way, right?
Sure. I don't know how exactly, but I'm sure we can find something to talk about.
I thought it would be fun for you and I to just look back on the past year and chat a little bit, but I wanted to do something else as well. I wanted to hear from our listeners out there. So we actually have a Google Voice. Is that what we have?
That's what it's called, yeah.
It's a Google Voice phone number that basically you dial the phone number, you go directly to voicemail, and you can record a voicemail that will send Matt and I an MP3 of that file, and then we can listen to it and play it on the show. So our plan here is we want to hear from you folks. As part of our finale, we want to hear from you. Why do you love the Dark Tower? Why is the Dark Tower so important to you? So you can call us and leave us a message, and what we'll do is we'll cut together like a compilation of all our listeners talking about the Dark Tower. So kind of turn the episode over to you guys. I think that's going to be a lot of fun, and I hope a lot of you participate because it's really cool. So you can call us at 720-386-2374. I'll also put that number in the show notes, but once again, it's 720-386-2374. It'll basically go directly to a voicemail, and then you leave a message. Try not to talk for longer than, I don't know. What do you think, Matt? A minute?
Yeah, I was going to say a minute.
Okay, yeah. Just because we gotta string these together, and if there's like 10 5-minute people, that really adds up. But
yeah, right.
Just let us know what do you love about the Dark Tower? Why is the Dark Tower so important to you? Let us know. Talk to us. You've heard our voices enough. It's time to hear your voices. So give us a call, leave us a message, and I think this is gonna be really fun and a fitting way to end season 1 of the show.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. So that's all for announcements. Let's move into it, Matt. Let's talk about the Little Sisters of Eluria. So we got to do our overall thing first here, of course. So this book was first written and published, as you've already kind of hinted, in the 1998 compilation Legends, which also included works from a whole lot of people. Robert Jordan, George R.R. Martin, Terry Pratchett, Ursula K. Le Guin, Terry Goodkind, a whole bunch more.
Yeah, man, Legends was a banger. I read the whole thing. Like, not only is it just from those authors, but it is like short stories from their major universes. You've got a Dark Tower story, you got an Earthsea story, you've got a Wheel of Time story, you've got a Dragon Riders of Perrin story, you got a Song of Ice and Fire, Dunk and Egg story. There's also stories from Tad Williams, who I was a fan of back then, and Orson Scott Card. Mm-hmm. Raymond Feist is the only author on this list whose name I don't immediately recognize, but I know I've heard it before.
Sure.
Yeah, just a monster of an anthology. Yeah,
I mean, it's very rare that you call a book Legends, and like that's not that's not hyperbole, because like this was like in the world of fantasy, especially in the 90s. This was huge. This was huge that this happened.
Yeah.
And I think I've never read this. Unfortunately, I think I've read the stories from it. Like I've read the Martin story from this for sure. I think these are all taking place within the universe of these big fantasy series, but I think they're all one-offs, right? Like none of them require you to understand those series.
Yeah,
I think that was like the goal of the thing.
I believe that is correct. If I remember correctly, the Wheel of Time story was like the backstory of one of the major characters, but you could have in theory read it independently. Yes.
Sure. All right. Yeah. So huge anthology, and King went back to Midworld for it. But in 1998, right? So this is before he finished it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And of course, this was eventually put into King's short story collection titled Everything's Eventual, which came out in 2002. That book also features the titular story about our old breaker buddy Dinky Earnshaw, which we will be reading and discussing in season 2 of our podcast.
Awesome.
So that's fun.
Yeah.
Before we get started on the story proper, I think I want to start on the author's note, because this story starts with a note from Stephen King. It says, "The Dark Tower the books begin with Roland of Gilead, the last gunslinger in an exhausted world that has moved on, pursuing a magician in a black robe. Roland has been chasing Walter for a very long time. In the first book of the cycle, he finally catches up. This story, however, takes place where Roland is still casting about for Walter's trail. A knowledge of the books is therefore not necessary for you to understand and hopefully enjoy the story which follows." So I think the big thing we have to talk about in that note is, of course, that last line there, right? That King has written this story specifically so that anyone reading it, whether they've read any Dark Tower book or not, could pick it up and follow along, no problem. I think, as we already kind of reasoned, this was maybe just like a request of the compilation. Like when all these authors were contacted, they said, okay, write a story in your universe, but please don't make it so if someone wants to buy this book, they have to read 12 giant epic fantasy sagas first. Right. But it does a really interesting thing, I think, that's worth talking about, right?
Yeah.
We get to look at exactly how King characterizes Roland here, because he's kind of, it's freeing in some ways, because he doesn't have to, like, he can pick and choose which bits of Roland he wants to include in this story. And so he gets to, like, decide how he wants to build him or rebuild him. You know, what is the wheat, what is the chaff of Roland's character? And maybe more importantly, the question is, who is Roland right now? And he gets to build him fresh, not with the baggage of 8 books worth of characterization.
Yes, indeed. That's maybe my favorite thing about this story, and I can't wait to drill down on this as we get through it. But yeah, I mean, and there's definitely a lot of like really subtle detail in here that I think, you know, the reader who has not read The Dark Tower will probably just gloss over. It'll have some effect on them,
sure,
but they won't understand kind of where it fits in with that picture of Roland.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of, I see King as loving challenges in writing, and I think this is a really interesting and specific challenge where it's like, write him well enough so that anyone can understand him, but you also kind of want to throw a bone to your constant reader and have them pick up on moments and character beats that other people would glass on over, but your constant reader is like, I see what you did there, Stephen. Mm-hmm. And I think he has a lot of fun with that in the story.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But I mean, the thing we have to talk about here is, like, this Roland is different, right? He is not the child that we saw in both Wizard and Glass and Wind Through the Keyhole, but he's also not the man we meet at the beginning of The Gunslinger. He's not that person yet either. He's in this weird kind of liminal state in the story, halfway between these two extremes of personality. And King has to manage to, like, say that to us without saying it, you know?
Yeah. Right. I mean, there's a moment where the story comes close to saying that, where, and we'll talk about it when we get there, but it says he's not yet the kind of person who would just gun people down in the street.
Yeah.
Whereas Gunslinger, you know, the Gunslinger era Roland absolutely is the kind of person who would gun people down in the street, yep, and does so. But yeah, like that's, I think there's just there's a lot in this story that tells you that this is kind of a younger, a little bit softer Roland, a little bit more relatable too. Like, it works better. This version of Roland works better as the protagonist of a short story, mm-hmm, that, especially sitting, you know, cheek by jowl in this anthology with a bunch of other kind of fantasy stories. Like, he's a lot more approachable. This is the most approachable version of Roland.
It definitely, the story definitely minimizes the unlikable aspects of his personality, for sure. But I think still hints at them under the surface, which is really cool.
You're right.
All right. So the story starts with, it's divided into 6 chapters. And I guess this would be a fun thing to talk about. The chapter names are really interesting, right? Because it's just like a list of events. You know, this one starts Full Earth, The Empty Town, The Bells, The Dead Boy, The Overturned Wagon, The Green Folk. And I think these are really interesting because as we go through the story, they kind of titillate you a little bit, because there's stuff in there you see that you're like, oh, okay. And it really gets you excited to read into the chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this one in particular, this is the beginning of the story where it's, you know, kind of a slow burn, anxiety and tension. And you know, what does that mean? Oh, there's going to be a dead boy. Okay,
yeah.
What are the green folk?
What are the green folk? Yeah. And then there's fun. He goes and checks the law book and sees, like, we moved the green folk on, and we, the reader, are like, oh, but did you? Because we know that this chapter will end with the green folk. Right.
Yeah.
So this story begins with Roland approaching the gates of a small town named Elluria. There is something really interesting here at the opening of this, and I think it's because this is a short story, because this is a separate thing. This is like the only Dark Tower stories we have in which Roland isn't, like, directly on a quest. like in Wizard and Glass and Wind Through the Keyhole, he was out the towns he was at for a specific reason. He had a mission. In every other story in the Dark Tower, he's chasing the man in black, or the town they come across is like between him and his tower. Elluria is just there, and Roland is just wandering. Like King says in his notes at the beginning of the book, he's still searching for the man in black's trail. So he hasn't he's not chasing after him. He's just kind of wandering around trying to pick up the trail of the man in black. So he's just like heading vaguely west. Mm-hmm. He's not like, it's such a defining characteristic of Roland to be this like plodding, like one foot in front of the other, always heading towards his mission type of character. And this story is not really about that, because he knows what his mission is and he's looking for the man in black, but he's not like hot on his heels. And so he's just he just walks up to this town and he's like, here's a weird town. Let's see what's up in here. Yeah.
Very different vibe here.
Mm-hmm.
It also kind of feels to me like the midworld that Roland is inhabiting here is actually a very, very dangerous place.
Yeah.
And also like this Roland is not quite the ultimate badass that he ultimately becomes.
No.
It really reminds me, and perhaps I'm only saying this because I'm remembering reading this as like a 14-year-old who's playing a lot of games, but it reminds me of being a low-level player in a game like EverQuest or something where everything can kill you and you have to be really careful. But yeah, so like this Roland just feels like he's much more unsure and kind of wary of everything. And I mean, maybe I say that because I know that he gets like successfully ambushed in 5 minutes, but
yeah, I want to circle back to that feeling, because I think you're absolutely right that is this feeling that the story creates in you, but us constant readers are not used to experiencing that with Roland. So I do think there's this disconnect where you see this group of green folk and you're just like, oh, he's fine.
Yeah.
These fucking slow mutants. Come on.
Yeah. Come on. There's only 6 of them or whatever. Yeah. It's nothing. Yeah.
And so I think King is playing off that in a really fun way, where like, I think your average reader who is just coming to this anthology would react just like you, where you feel the danger. But like us, it's kind of this shocking turn moment where you're like, wait, what? No, not Roland to Shane.
Right.
No.
Yep.
It's very fun.
It is.
So Roland enters the completely empty and very spooky town of Elluria. I love the patience with which King like rolls out this early part of the book. I think it's so important to establish the tone of the story, to just really spend 10 pages of the 60-page short story having him wander the town and just get this feeling of nothingness, but also something isn't right. And by just random coincidence, we talked, like we said, about Children of the Corn last night.
Mm-hmm.
And this is exactly what that movie should have done. This is exactly how that movie should have started. Characters entering a spooky town and it being empty and not being sure what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Mystery and tension, much better than their absence.
Yeah.
Hashtag
I mean,
Patreon.
Can you imagine this short story starting with the Little Sisters talking about how they're vampires, and that the next time someone comes along the town, we're going to catch them and suck their blood?
Yeah, exactly.
How shitty would that be?
Right. Yeah. Just completely ruin it, basically. Yeah.
It's been 24 hours and I still haven't gotten over how mad we got about Children of the Corn.
So stupid. So to hear more on that, patreon.com/doofmedia.
Oh man, we are good capitalists. All right. So I love that there's like nothing specifically wrong in the town, but it has this creepy feel. And I love this line here. Something here's a long way from right, the gunslinger thought. Where, Roland? This place has a reddish odor. I love that choice.
I do too. I love a lot of Roland's musing to himself in this story.
Mm-hmm.
What I did not love was that the audiobook reader chose to read a Southern accent for all of Roland's thoughts and sayings.
Yeah, that's infuriating.
Yeah, so the audiobook reader is a dangerous fool who should be sent west. It was annoying. It's like I have a very specific voice for Roland. Okay, don't mess with my Roland voice.
Well, it's interesting though, because I got the audiobook too, because I read this and then I listened to it because you piqued my interest about how bad this guy's accent was, and I agreed with you. It's not that the accent was bad per se, but it's just like it didn't fit Roland.
No.
But then I was like, trolling around on the internet, and apparently there's a version of this story that Frank Muller reads. And I was like, what? Huh? Why didn't I get that one?
Yeah. What the hell? Now I want to go download that and listen to that.
Yeah. I don't know if it's unconfirmed. So if someone out there has listened to the Frank Muller version, please let us know. But how did I not get that?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. Oh, well. This is also the first instance of us hearing the singing bugs and also the bells, which kind of both become the soundtrack of this entire story, this combination of these two things.
Yeah, the sound of the bugs is like a perfect note to fill out this picture of this creepy, empty town. Mm-hmm. I always find that the droning sound of bugs is one of those primeval noises that, if anything is underutilized in storytelling, it's just such a perfect thing.
Yeah, it's very good. It's very good. It's inherently creepy in a lot of ways.
Yeah, right.
So I want to focus a bit here on Roland's horse, Topsy, who we learn at the opening of the story is basically on his last leg and will die very, very soon. So we get this line here. The gunslinger stood in his dusty boots and faded jeans under the beating sun, stroking the roan's matted neck, pausing every now and then to yank his fingers through the tangles of Topsy's mane, and stopping once to shoo off the tiny flies clustering at the corner of Topsy's eyes. Let them lay their eggs and hatch their maggots there after Topsy was dead, but not before. Roland thus honored his horse as best he could, listening to those distant dreamy bells and the strange wooden talking sound as he did. I love this because this strikes me as like quintessentially Roland, right? He's riding this horse to its death. This horse is about to die, and it's dying because Roland's in the middle of fucking nowhere, and his horse is sick, and there's no horse doctor anywhere. And the reason he's in the middle of fucking nowhere is because he's chasing after this person who doesn't even know where he is. So he's going to kill his horse for his tower. This is going to be another thing sacrificed to the altar of the Dark Tower. But he's going to take very, very good care of it until he sacrifices it to the tower, right? Yeah. Like, he'll feed it. He's going to tell it stories. He'll save it from slow mutants before he lets it fall off a cliff. Like, this is just what Roland does.
Yeah, I mean, he likes the horse. He's being very human towards the horse. He's caring for it. Caring for it even as he kind of uses it up, which is really his whole MO. I think it's very fitting that this is here. It's a really minor note, you know. I do think that a person just reading this story for the first time wouldn't really make much of Topsy the horse, other than, you know, it's just a plot beat. He came into town on a horse and then the horse dies. But you know, tower junkies are going to be like, yep, of course the horse dies.
There's another.
Yep, gotta sacrifice something.
Yep. It's so great. Roland wanders into town, seeing a large church dedicated to the Jesus Man, also some saloons, a law office, but nothing that explains where everyone went and what happened in this town.
I do find myself wondering why it's the Jesus Man and not the man Jesus.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? I don't know if that's just King being inconsistent and just being like, this time I wanted to write Jesus Man. I don't know, but it's interesting. I
wonder, this is complete bullshit, but I wonder if he wrote Man Jesus and then like the editor of the Legends compendium was like, what the hell is this? And he's like, it's the man Jesus. It's the thing. And then being like, nobody's gonna understand that. You got too many weird words in this story, King. Get rid of 8 of them, okay? And then he just changed it to Jesus. Changed it to Jesus Man because that's a little bit more like normal.
Because if it starts with Jesus, then we understand.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? But that's a lot of fun. I think the way religion is treated in this story is pretty interesting. We'll get into this more later, but in this opening bit, like, Roland basically says, you know, Christianity is not a very known religion in this world, not a very known and celebrated religion in this world, which is kind of true based on what we've seen. But also, like, I feel like so much of the story was pulling from Christian imagery. Like in Tull, we had that whole thing, and then of course Father Callahan, once he gets to Caliban Sturgis, like I get that Christ is not the dominant religion of the place, but it seems to have a dominant role in Roland's story. I
mean, yeah, from the beginning of the Gunslinger, we've got Sylvia Pittston bringing her sort of corrupted version of Christianity in.
Yeah.
I mean, you could say that maybe it wasn't before the world started to move on, and then it became more of a part of the world once the world moved on.
Yeah,
possibly.
I think that's a good argument. Yeah.
Okay.
I like this line as well. So now he knew the name of the town, at least. Elluria. Pretty, yet somehow ominous as well. But any name would have seemed ominous, Roland supposed, given the circumstances. Just as an FYI, Elluria is an Israeli name meaning precious flower. So it actually is a pretty word.
Yeah,
but
it's a pretty word. But like, I feel like the reason it sounds ominous is that it's like alluring or luring. Yeah. But you got to assume that King like heard that word and then was like, yeah, got to use that word somewhere. Maybe a Dark Tower short story.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it is a lot of fun because there's a lot of this story. We're going to get into it when we get to the Little Sisters themselves, but there's a lot of the story where you're like wondering if Roland's being kind of manipulated, you know, like, and just like the Little Sisters of alluring you.
Yeah, right.
and there's one very beautiful sister that is really into Roland and he's really into her. And you're just like, what's going on?
Yeah, this is very suspicious.
Yeah. So Roland sees nothing and no life until he notices an old dog chewing on a boot sticking out of a water trough. He should have shot it. It was no good to itself, and a dog that had acquired the taste for human flesh could be no good to anyone else. But he somehow didn't like to. Killing the only thing still living in this town, other than the singing bugs that was, seemed like an invitation to bad luck. So this, Matt, is our Deus Ex Jesus dog, who has a cross, a fur-shaped cross on his heart. I think it's black on white fur. And it's interesting reading the story right after coming off of the end of Wind Through the Keyhole, right? Where textually in that story, it was Tim's mercy towards the animal that led to his success. And kind of the same thing happens here. Roland says, I should kill this thing. I'm not going to. And it's because of his mercy in that moment that he survives the story.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's the Gollum dog. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess King was really on a anti-killing animals kick for a while. But yeah, I think this is another beat that shows, you know, this is a softer Roland. This is a Roland, like his thoughts are still hard because he thinks that he should kill the dog, but his heart is soft and his trigger finger isn't quite so eager. So he doesn't kill the dog.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at this story as kind of just another like chink in the heart of Roland that will turn it hard, right?
Yeah.
Like this is a story that he starts alone, meets people, and then ends alone. And it's like, you just imagine he had like 100 of these same type of one-off adventures that always ended with him leaving the place by himself, alone, miserable. And you just kind of see how his heart just gets harder and harder.
Right. You know, I don't know if this quite goes to the level of like, I don't know where this sits in terms of textual analysis, but I notice now that if Roland had actually just been the hard ass, the ultimate hard ass version of himself here, and he shot the dog, and then he turned around and he saw the slow mutants, and then he just immediately shot all the slow mutants, then everything would have been fine, actually. He would have just proceeded on from the town. But it's because he showed mercy to both the dog and the slow mutants that he's able to survive. The adventure.
Yeah, so it's like this idea. It's not a story that's saying mercy is bad, right? Because he shows mercy to the green folk, or well, almost all of them. Not one of them, not. But he shows mercy to them, and that bites him in the ass. But his earlier act of mercy saves him.
Right.
So it's like the lesson is not mercy is bad. The lesson is mercy is a two-bladed sword. Sometimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could say that he suffers due to his mercy, but he also gains this touching experience with Jenna.
Yeah.
And he sort of saves and redeems Jenna also.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, like this is a story about Jenna, right?
Yeah, right.
It's like it's less about. I mean, it is about Roland, but he remains fairly constant through it. It's Jenna that's going through a lot of the stuff.
I think you're right.
So, we have this moment where, having chased off the dog, Roland goes to see the corpse of the poor boy that the dog was chewing on. We learn it's a young boy named James, who has the medallion on him. James, love of family, loved of God. And obviously we have another Dark Tower property that is heavily influenced by religion. It makes sense, as this is going to be revealed as another vampire story. But we have to remember that this is before King returns to Callahan's story with wolves. But we can already see here in this story, especially, the idea of sigils of faith and sigils in general are a very important part of this world. And I think like the biggest recurring motif of the story in general is the idea of sigils and the power that they have and the things that they do, because it's not just these medallions, they're all over the place in the story.
It's true. Yeah. I was thinking a lot about how this stuff plays with Callahan's arc, because his cross, his sigil or sigil, it's funny because the audiobook usually says sigil, even though it's obviously the word sigil.
Yeah. It's spelled sigil. Yeah.
Right. Callahan's cross lost its power when he lost his faith. And yet in the end, he didn't even really need a sigil. It was just his own faith that mattered. And I think that there's actually no contradiction here, because the medallion brings protection because of the faith of the people and the faith, the faith in God. Yeah. And so that's what empowers the medallions.
Yeah. Yeah. But we're definitely going to be pointing out all the other sigils that are at place in this story.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's in this moment that Roland's horse falls over and dies, which alerts him to a group of green slow mutants slowly approaching him. Roland attempts to warn them off, killing one that charges them. And then, of course, we got this part. We have to talk about this for a little bit. All right. He was the first to move. Who wants to be the second? None did, it seemed. They only stood there watching him, not coming at him, but not retreating either. He thought, as he had thought about the crucifix dog, that he should just kill them as they stood there, just draw his gun and mow them down. It would be the work of seconds only, and child's play to his gifted hands, even if some ran. But he couldn't. Not just cold like that. He wasn't that kind of killer. At least, not yet. I love that last line, of course, because, I mean, obviously, this to me is Stephen King kind of winking at constant readers with the knowing wink towards who Roland will become in the future. But there's also a second layer of this where you could say perhaps this is, yes, the narrator, but also Roland's thoughts as well, that he is acknowledging on some level that he is transforming into this cold-hearted killer.
I think my first thought was that it's mainly King winking at us, the readers, who know how Roland evolves. But of course, the first time reader is also going to read it as, you know, this guy is on a hard road and he's going to become harder. And that's what this text is saying. And he's aware of it. Yeah. And of course, King would be aware of that interpretation as well.
Yeah. I mean, I almost like that more, because just the idea of Roland saying consciously to himself, I'm not that type of person yet, that he's acknowledging that he's going to become that person. Right. It's just delicious for me.
I agree. Yeah. Sidebar here, but I did think it was really interesting how the slow mutants are depicted as being way more like sapient than the ones under the mountain seem to be in the Gunslinger.
Yeah, he kind of plays fast and loose with the rules of slow mutants and like what classifies. Like, it's not like slow mutant is like a class of animal, right? It just seems to be a word that you assign to any kind of muty human.
Yes, they because I mean, you could even call the green folk in Went Through the Keyhole slow mutants, I suppose, right?
Yeah, you could. Yeah,
I mean that text does not, but yeah, no, it's just, like maybe it has to do with like how far along they are, because you know one of these guys can actually talk. I didn't get the sense that any of the ones in the Gunslinger could talk. Maybe they were just, you know, much more far gone or something like that.
Yeah, could be. I don't know. But then something happens to Roland, Matt. Something that never, ever happens. The green folk get the drop on him with one simple boo. A green folk appears from behind Roland and clubs one of his hands. He's surrounded and beaten. And I love this part. The gunslinger was able to slip the first couple of blows, and there was one moment where he thought he might be able to spin around the rear of the overturned wagon, spin it and turn and go to work with his guns. Surely he would be able to do that. Surely his quest for the Dark Tower wasn't supposed to end on the sun-blasted street of a little far western town called Elluria at the hands of half a dozen green-skinned slow mutants. Surely Ka could not be so cruel. So Matt, I mean, we kind of prefaced this earlier in the conversation, but something gets the drop on Roland and beats the shit out of him. And it's not like a trained gunslinger. It's not like the smartest person that's ever lived. It's a bunch of mutants. And literally all he did was hide behind a cart and then sneak up on him.
Yeah, it's crazy. I don't really have a good explanation for this in mind. I think, well, number one, Roland is much less, superhuman than he becomes later. And it's just unimaginable that such a thing could happen to our Roland. Maybe there's some specific distraction at play that I'm not noticing. Or maybe he was just simply underestimating his foe. Like he was sort of thinking of the slow mutants as being too stupid to attempt an ambush. And that's his undoing.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because this is not a young Roland, right? He's older here. We don't know exactly how many years he's been after the Man in Black at this point, but it's been a lot. Like he speaks of Magus as if it's a thing that happened a long, long time ago.
Yeah, I don't know.
And I mean, later when he claims that the kid is his brother, the sisters comment, "Wow, you two have a really big difference in age."
Right.
Like he's way younger than you. So, I mean, this is not a green Roland. This is a trained Roland who's been a gunslinger for a long, long time. But still, he gets his ass handed to him here.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you think there's anything else to it? Like what are we saying exactly about the fact that this happened?
No, I mean, I think the underestimating of his opponent is absolutely part of it. The story kind of throws lip service to the idea that like he the dust all over the ground was like carpeting their footsteps, and perhaps the chirping of the bugs and the bells like was throwing enough sound around to where like there was this blanket of white noise that was kind of masking movement. I'm only saying this because like I'm playing white noisemakers constantly because of my baby right now. And like, you can't hear anything else. Like we'll be playing white noise and my wife will whisper to me and I just have to be like, I have no fucking clue what you just said.
That's great.
So, I mean, this is very possible that like it's a combination of all these things. And I mean, maybe this is just one of the times that he learned his lesson and became better. I mean, I think Court would definitely be super disappointed in Roland at this whole thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like this is basically the reason why Ka wasn't ready for Roland to draw his 3 until he was much older was that he hadn't learned all of these little lessons and made all these mistakes.
Yeah, sure. I love that line, surely Ka could not be so cruel, because of course we know that yes, it absolutely can. And in fact, Roland, allowing you to live and survive this encounter will in the end be much, much more cruel than just dying here would ever be for you.
Oh, Roland, you sweet summer child.
It's so wonderful. It's another one of those things that I think passes by the new reader, but the constant reader is like, fuck yeah.
Yeah, right.
I mean, but the important part is they beat the shit out of him and they win. I love like this line here is there's so much awareness here. Like there was one moment when he thought he might be able to spin around to the rear of the overturned wagon, spin and turn and go to work with his guns. That's what happens in any other story involving Roland, right? Like right. That moment is just what happens in those stories, but it's not meant to be here in this one.
Yeah, well, Ka needed him to meet Jenna, so
it did. So then we move on to the second chapter titled Rising, Hanging, Suspended, White Beauty, 2 Others, and the Medallion. Roland awakes and finds himself suspended from straps above a bed in a large and extremely white infirmary tent. I love how King describes his waking up as not waking, but arising, right? The gunslinger's return to the world wasn't like coming back to consciousness after a blow, which he'd done several times before, and it wasn't like waking from sleep either. It was like rising, which is very specific and interesting because I think it's trying to begin to make you unsettled about what's going on here. Like he opens up in this giant tent filled with whiteness and he's being caressed by this cool hand and everything seems okay. Like this is a healing tent and it's good and white and pure, but there's something going on immediately. So I'm really curious, like, even in this moment, before we meet the Little Sisters themselves, were you worried in this moment? Were you already starting to get a little concerned?
Well, I think if I throw myself back to the first time I read this, it didn't actually occur to me that the people taking care of him would be bad guys. Like, I think I only realized that this is definitely not a good situation when the other sisters show up specifically. But I mean, I think also I was like really young back then, and I think like I didn't know how stories worked. I think now I recognize like this is too good to be true. And this is obviously the plot of the story, actually, is Roland getting ensnared with the sisters, which is, of course, what the name of the story is.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, it's interesting because like King is channeling a lot of imagery here that has very specific meaning in the Dark Tower universe, right? Like this constant white imagery, this pillowy, bright, pure white has very specific meanings in this story, because like the white is the goodness, right? Mm-hmm. It is. So there's the constant reader in you is kind of thrown off here a little bit. And I think King continues to use this juxtaposition in really interesting ways, because I think it's a lot of what the book is saying through the Little Sisters about this juxtaposition. It's really, really interesting. But your first impression is just like, oh, this is good.
Yeah.
It's white. It's good.
Yeah, right. There's one thing that King does throughout the story where, and it's going to, I think, get laid on a bit more thickly in a second, where he does begin to make you start to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And you're not really sure what exactly it is that's making you feel uncomfortable. But you go from kind of being like, oh, thank God he made it, to starting to wonder what the hell's going on, and then starting to realize that something is up. But it's such an incremental, gradual, and subtle build toward that.
Yeah. No, I think you're totally right. And one of the things that fascinates me about writing so much is how you do this. Mm-hmm. How you because I think a lot of it is really subtle. Like you don't want to lay all your cards on the table. And so a lot of it just comes down to word usage and like descriptions. Like when we see this bearded man, right? Like he looks in the tent and he sees two people in there with him. One is a kid that looks exactly like the dead boy he saw in the trough. And he has this real moment of like, wait, was I wrong? Was that kid not really dead? Wait, no, that doesn't make sense. So that brings some unease into this, because you're like, how is the dead kid sitting here in a bed?
Right.
And then we go over to the bearded man on the other side of the room, and we get this excellent passage. The bearded man was either asleep or unconscious. Roland could hear him snoring, and was suspended 3 feet above his bed, held by a complex series of white belts that glimmered in the dim air. These crisscrossed each other, making a series of figure eights all the way around the man's body. He looked like a bug in some exotic spider's web. So like choosing that kind of imagery is very like, it's invoking the feeling of trapped, right?
Right.
Like a bug trapped in a spider's web, but it doesn't even call attention to itself. Like, he didn't say he looked like a bug trapped in some exotic spider's web. He just looked like a bug in a spider's web. And the connotation of that, the reader has to kind of do on their own. And they might even do it unconsciously.
Right.
But it just introduces a feeling.
Yeah, it gives you, of course, the feeling like Roland himself may also be trapped in a spider's web.
Yeah.
Narratively, which of course he is. But yeah, that's a perfect example of making you feel subconsciously uncomfortable and maybe not even understanding why.
It's so good. It's one of those things that I think I love pointing it out when I see it, because I don't think it almost by definition doesn't get noticed, because that's the point of it. Mm-hmm. For you to not notice it, but it's harder than it looks. It's such a careful thing to navigate.
Yeah.
You know, you're like on the edge of a cliff, and you have to thread the needle a lot of the times. And I think King so often achieves this, and it makes it look effortless.
Yeah. I do think this is really, really fun to talk about. And, it's one of the master level things that he does. Because I think I'm having all these like flashbacks to being younger, because I do really actually remember reading this the first time. And I feel like when I was around that age, which really would have been like high school age, I would have read that sentence and I would have just, maybe if we're stretching it, I would have thought like, that's imagery. I know what that is. Mm-hmm. Stephen King is using imagery here. And because what he's doing is he's invoking the fact that you can easily visualize and imagine like a spider silk hanging down and wrapping something up. And then you're going to kind of borrow that mental imagery and port that over into the thing you're seeing in the story, and it helps you visualize it. And it's like, okay, but that's like only half of it. The other half is the connotation that that Roland is trapped in a trap. He's trapped in a spider's web, and literally there's a spider that's going to come try to eat him. Like that's the other half that makes it excellent, right? Yeah.
It's so good, and like I said, I feel like it's a choice to not use the word trapped in that sentence, right? It's like, I don't know if he did it consciously or unconsciously, but you're writing the sentence, "He looked like a bug in some exotic spider's web." And I feel like the impulse there is to use the word trapped.
Right.
And he chooses not to. And I think that's what really sells it, because I think you use that word in that sentence and everything's gone. Like, you immediately know, okay, it's bad. It's 100% bad. There's no questioning. He's trapped. He's fucked. And King is not ready to like reveal that yet, because he holds that until we meet the sisters themselves, and then he's laying it on. So he wants you to leave this chapter feeling concerned, but not 100% sure that Roland's in immediate danger.
Yeah, there's also this thing we don't talk about a ton, but I think we talk about sometimes, where like this bit of prose is sort of written through the eyes of Roland, and consequently, Roland's not super worried, so he's not going to be thinking stuff like the man looked like he was trapped, because he's just not thinking that he's not thinking about being trapped. He's thinking, thank God I'm still alive. And so you're, in addition to all the stuff we just talked about, there's also the element where you have to be convincingly inside the character's perspective and not throwing sentences in there that are sort of obviously contaminating, your authorial intent into what the character would actually be perceiving. So like, it's totally reasonable that Roland would think that it looked like a bug in a spider's web. And he wouldn't be thinking about the fact that it looks like a bug that's trapped and about to be eaten.
Yeah.
He wouldn't make that connotation. So like, there's a Doyleist and a Watsonian level to this.
Yeah. That's great. I love that. You're right. Awesome. All right. We spent enough time on this.
Yes.
Let's move on. So we finished this sentence with Roland kind of psyching himself up. This is another very kind of anti-Roland thing here. It makes him seem younger than he is. "I'm not ready," he whispered. His lips felt very dry. He closed his eyes again, wanting to sleep, wanting to not think about what the bearded man's twisted legs might indicate about his own condition. But you better get ready. That was the voice that always seemed to come when he tried to slack off, to scamp a job, or take an easy way around an obstacle. It was the voice of Court, his old teacher, the man whose stick they had all feared as boys. They hadn't feared his stick as much as his mouth, however. His jeers when they were weak, his contempt when they complained or tried whining about their lot. "Are you a gunslinger, Roland? If you are, you better get ready." It's just a really wonderful way to end everything.
Especially since, we know who Court is, and so that actually makes us smile.
It does. Good old Court. I mean, again, we have to look at the things that King chooses to bring into the Roland story for new people. Like, what does he want you to know about Roland? And of course, Court's voice talking in his head is one of the things that King reestablishes in this character, because it was such a core part of him that every time that this voices in general appearing in Roland's head is a very core part of him. But Court being one of the most present ones works very, very well.
Absolutely. It's also hard to imagine, older Roland ever whispering to himself, "I'm not ready," right? He'd just be like, "All right, bring it on," right? Like he still has the voice of Court, but Court is not. Court is goading him about different things. Later in his life.
Yeah, I mean, I would never think Gunslinger Roland would say that.
Yeah,
but here he is, a younger, older version of Roland. So we move on to chapter 3, titled 5 Sisters, Jenna, the Doctors of Elluria, the Medallion, a Promise of Silence. Such evocative. I really love these. King doesn't do this with chapter titles very often, but I'm so glad he did it here because it's really fun.
Yeah, me too.
So Roland awakes next to see our titular Little Sisters of Eluria. And if there was any doubt about these women and if they are bad news, the book makes it very clear by directly comparing them to Rhea of the Coos. So it's like the first thing he does is he opens his eyes and is like, oh, look, it's 5 Rheas. So no doubt in our minds at this point, right?
Right. Yep. Exactly.
But it is interesting the way they're dressed, right? The five were dressed in billowing habits as white as the walls and the panels of the ceiling. Their antique crones' faces were framed in wimples just as white, their skin as gray and runneled as droughted earth by comparison. Hanging like phylacteries from the bands of silks imprisoning their hair, if they indeed had hair, were lines of tiny bells which chimed as they moved or spoke. Upon the snowy breasts of their habit was embroidered a blood-red rose, the sigil of the Dark Tower. One of the things I love the most about the sisters is how they are taking the practices and the images that are like universal goods in this universe and twisting them and warping them to their evil purposes. Like, we'll learn later that this is basically how they survive, right? They're not the Little Sisters of Eluria. They're the Little Sisters of wherever they throw their tent, and they just move from town to town, promising to heal people, usually in war-torn places or places when there's a lot of action, and they set up their tent and they heal the people. And it's so nice, and then they eat them.
Yeah.
And so they're clothed in the white and donning the rose, right? The one of the most pure symbols or sigils that the series has, the rose, this thing that represents ultimate goodness. They're taking that and they're warping it and they're using it, and it's like disgusting.
Yeah, part of me is surprised they can even wear the rose without bursting into flame or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that like the world allows them to profane these images, these sigils.
Yeah, and
I think it goes to show like what a sigil means in this world, right? Like that the power it has is not innate. Mm-hmm. It is what is granted to it. The rose means nothing to these people, so it does nothing to them.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, it's also, I'm trying to think through like just the fact that the rose is never really used as like a holy symbol.
Yeah.
Like the rose is almost a kind of ambiguous symbol. So is the tower, for that matter.
Sure.
Like the tower, you're never really quite entirely sure whether the tower is like aligned with the white or if it's just sort of perpendicular to it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot more. I mean, it's the Dark Tower after all. It's not the White Tower. The White Tower is the antipode of the Dark Tower. The White Tower is love. Sure. So
I would argue that the rose is less ambiguous than the tower, though. I would argue that the rose is much more clear, like in its innate goodness. Like, I mean, that's like. Every time we're around the rose, like the description, you know, like that everything good happens, like every coincidence that makes for goodness happens. You feel complete. You feel powerful. It invigorates your life. It like everything good is the rose.
It clears up your eczema. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, so maybe I'm splitting hairs here, but that's the one rose that's in New York City. Whereas the generic symbol of the rose for the tower just sort of refers to all of the various roses that are surrounding the tower.
Sure, but I mean that's fair.
But you're totally right, though, that the rose in the Dark Tower is explicitly white aligned. So I'm still not sure what to make of it. Honestly, I'm just trying to kind of think about it from all different angles.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what this story is doing. I mean, we'll see it in a sec with Jenna, but. Well, I'll just save it till we get to Jenna.
Okay.
But I do love the little introduction of the sisters too, because they don't act like vampires. You know, we learn that they're vampires, but as Roland puts it, they're more like crones and witches, right? Like the way they talk, the way they act. He wakes, one of them cried in a gruesomely coquettish voice. Ooh, they fluttered like birds. Like it's this very distinct feeling. Like they're not like, you think vampire, you think like much more suave and like composed and like they allure you with their sexuality. But these are just like old creepy witch ladies that also suck your blood.
Yeah, I mean, they seem like they just might be like crappy vampires, like vampires who are barely surviving and scraping by and not very good at their job. I mean, you realize they're awful, whereas I think most vampires in fiction, you don't immediately realize they're awful as soon as you see them.
Yeah,
like you're just like, oh, it's a handsome older gentleman maybe, but like they don't seem horrifying. But yeah, here, I mean, King wastes no time making it clear that they're terrible and can't be trusted. It like sort of does away with the ambiguity pretty much right here, where you're just like, oh, okay, these are bad.
And that's a choice, right? Like he could have kept the illusion up a little bit longer. I mean, speaking of the illusion, one of the first things he does is show how shitty their glamour is, and that they're not actually as young as they look. They're old and decrepit, and their glamours themselves are fading. So he's not interested in any ambiguity anymore here. And I wonder why specifically that is. Like, it's a short story. He just like, let's not waste time.
Yeah.
The reader knows that he's in some shit. We played with it a little bit, but it's time to put all our cards down because we have the second half of the story to do.
Yes, because I think that he basically decided that he wanted. So I was gonna save this connection for later in the discussion, but it occurred to me while I was going over this to make the notes that there's some comparisons to Misery, actually, where you've got the plot of a man who is injured and somewhat incapacitated, and he's bedridden, and so the actual plot of the story becomes this psychological game of cat and mouse between him and the captor.
Yeah.
And it's like in that story, okay, I haven't actually read Misery, but at least in the movie, it spends relatively little time letting you be really kind of unsure about God, I forgot her name. It's terrible. Annie. And pretty quickly revealing like, oh, okay, she's a monster. And I think it's a similar thing here, and it's for similar reasons. That it's like, it's kind of fun to be ambiguous and tense about the ambiguity for a minute, but then you want to get into the cat and mouse game. And that's what King is doing here. He's getting us into the cat and mouse game as quickly as possible.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. You're totally right. And I think Misery does the same thing.
Yeah.
One day you will read the book, and it does have some fun with it at the beginning, but we learn that Annie Wilkes is very quickly not on his side.
Sure.
So yeah. But we haven't met all our sisters yet, Matt, because we have one left. So all 5 of the sisters are tormenting Roland until the sixth one comes. This one is Sister Jenna, and she's everything the old crones are not. She actually looks really young. She's kind, and her touch is soothing to Roland. And of course, the bells on her head are a slightly different color. They're black bells, different. Roland is immediately like super smitten with this girl, like immediately, especially her single black curl poking out of her habit.
Yeah.
I love this line here, like, he was fascinated by the black curl lying on the cream of her brow, would have stroked it if he had dared reach up just to tell its texture. He found it beautiful because it was the only dark thing in all this white. The white had lost its charm for him.
Yeah, which maybe is your first clue that it's not above board white. It's glamour white.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's the interesting thing, right? Is like, there's many feelings you have here. The first feeling I think I had, and I kind of want to question you about this, is who's this chick? And she's obviously clearly working a spell on Roland here, because he's just like immediately smitten, like just immediately like, I got to kiss this lady. Get me out of here. So I want to touch this curl to see how this curl of hair feels. He's just horny as shit immediately, to the point where it feels unnatural.
Yeah, I was suspicious of this. And that's the thing, that there's a sort of judo where you become suspicious of the sisters because we just saw that they're terrifying. And then, but there's one of them that's pretty. Well, now that's even more suspicious, damn it. Right. So like,
right.
You're excessively suspicious of Jenna. And I think that's actually a fun little trick that he's pulled on us by making it so obvious that the sisters are not to be trusted. He makes you mistrust Jenna as well.
Yeah. And he has a lot of fun with that, I think, through a lot of the story, until we finally get to the point where like, oh no, actually she's just playing straight,
right?
Which is kind of surprising in its how unsurprising it is.
Yeah, exactly.
This is probably a beat that is too small for you to remember, but Roland did reference Sister Jenna before, or we can assume so, I guess. There's this whole scene in Wolves of the Calla where he accidentally calls Susanna Mia, and then like maybe intentionally just to like gauge her response to that.
Right.
And then he says, if she did call him out on it, he'd apologize and tell her he'd gone toe dash directly from a dream of someone he'd known long ago. although there only had been one woman of any importance after Susan Delgado, and her name had not been Mia. So Roland is most likely talking about Jenna here. There's really no one else it could be.
At least that
so
we've
this is
met.
So this is kind of a fun link back to this story that maybe a constant reader would catch up on, but of course you did not the first time we were reading it.
Of course. Yeah.
I think when we read it, the only person you could assume is Allie, right? Like there's no one else in the story that we thought it could have been.
Yeah.
And that didn't seem to fit Allie.
Right. Yeah. I feel like, interesting. Yeah. I'm sort of debating whether there might be some other mysterious woman we were supposed to infer existed somewhere, just because this is really a very short relationship they have, even if you want to call it that. But maybe his feelings are so strong that he does remember her that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think she leaves a pretty lasting impression on him from this story.
Yeah,
it's just another in a long list of woman that likes Roland does not survive their encounter.
Yeah. There you go.
Which there are quite a few of those. I was trying to remember which women have survived any kind of romantic encounter with Roland, and it's Mrs. Tassenbaum, and it's the lady in Calabrian Sturgis whose name I'm blanking on, the one that took care of the church with Father Callahan. She survives.
Yeah, it's not 100% death rate, so
no, but it's not. Your odds are not good if you got the hots for Roland.
Yep.
So Sister Jenna fills Roland in on what's going on here. She kind of explains that they're nurses. I really love this touch though, because she says we are hospitalers, or were before the world moved on. So she didn't lie in that moment, right? Like she's like, we're not nurses anymore,
right?
She's not, because we learn later that she's bad at lying, right? That she's not very good at lying. And so she gets away with that here by just giving them a half truth.
Yeah.
So this is when we learn about the bugs, because Roland says, if you're nurses, where are the doctors? And Jenna agrees to show him as long as he doesn't scream. And I really just wanted to highlight this touch here, because he says, he said, falling into the half-forgotten patois of the Outer Ark without ever being aware of it, Susan's dialect. It had been a long since I screamed, pretty. Once again, just a core character beat of Roland that obviously Stephen thought was important enough to reestablish in this, is he is just immediately adaptable to any culture or situation he's in.
Yeah.
He just unconsciously just adapts to their way of speaking. He just falls into it just right away. And that's always been true of him. And King felt it was so important that he does it again here.
Yeah, right. It's one of his fundamental traits that he can just blend in easily. I love it.
Yeah. So this is when we learn that the doctors are bugs, singing bugs that apparently eat the wounds off the sick and dying. They're covering Roland's back right now, as he was apparently dragged by the green folk for a very long time, to the point where his entire back, the flesh of his entire back, has just been totally ripped off, which is just a way worse injury than we were thinking.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that he, walks away from this.
Yeah.
I don't actually remember any reference to a horrific scarring on his back, but
oh no, there definitely is.
There is. Okay, that's funny.
His back is totally scarred, and I think we assumed it was like years and years of battle and scrapes and fights, but I guess a lot of it comes just from right here.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't remember that. Do you remember where that reference is?
Not specifically.
Okay.
It just talks about him scarred a lot.
Okay. Yeah, that's that. Yeah, okay, cool. Continuity.
But these doctor bugs, Matt, we've actually seen these bugs before. They were the ones that Oi took to pieces back in the Dixie Pig when our characters went charging in there. Oi was like bred to fight these vampire bugs. So it seems like they have this ongoing relationship, this symbiotic relationship with vampires.
Yeah, like it's interesting. It makes you ask a bunch of questions, like, are vampires in the Stephen King universe just sacks of bugs? Which is sort of implied at the end of the story. I like what you said about symbiotic relationships, because they do seem to have like identities, right?
Yeah.
They're not literally like if they were just sacks of bugs, then you would imagine that they could like reconstitute themselves after their body was ripped apart. I think it's more like a symbiotic relationship. I like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we can speculate on it when we get there, but the one thing is it's not totally clear.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering at this point of the story, okay, Jenna, what's your feeling right now about Jenna? She's just supplied a bunch of information. She seems to be helping Roland. Are you on to her here?
I was pretty suspicious still. I think King is making us suspicious on purpose. We really have no reason to trust her. Like it would make total sense, like storytelling wise, if we later learn like, oh, she's actually the one in charge of the sisters. Actually, she's actually super old and she's the most ugly and horrible looking of all of them. And she's she's the most powerful. And that's why she's able to use her glamour to look young and fetching and make Roland horny for her. I mean, you could argue that she indeed is using a glamour of some kind and she's not actually a human. And I think that I think that King is trying to make us suspicious that it's all a trick.
Yeah.
And that way it's more of a happy surprise when she comes through in the end.
Yeah. I mean, you really think like this is just another tale in the long Dark Tower history of scary bad women are manipulating you, right? Like we talked about this a lot during the Wind Through the Keyhole, and this feeling of the women in Midworldian culture are just sneaky manipulators. And you really expect that that's what's going on here. It just seems like what you would do. Like you have a story with vampires and glamour. It just seems like the perfect trick and a really interesting story choice would just for him to fall totally head over heels for this woman. And then it's all part of her plan. And like this wonderful moment where she frees him. And that's when the reveal happens.
Right.
So it is really surprising that that's just not the way this is interested in going at all.
Yeah. I mean, she seems too good to be true. And King kind of plays into that. And then, and then surprises us.
All right. Moving on to chapter 4, A Bowl of Soup, The Boy in the Next Bed, and the Night Nurses. So Roland awakes again, being poked on the nose with a spoon by a little sister. The little sister talks to him a little bit about Jenna and accidentally lets it spill that she's special in some way. It's because of the black bell she has. They make her special. And so King is drip feeding us information about this whole situation.
Yeah, I love that.
And then we also get to meet the boy in the bed next to Roland, who we find out is not the reincarnated body of the kid Roland saw dead, but just his brother. They both have matching gold medallions, and this is like the first hint we get that it is those very medallions that are keeping the two of them safe and alive here right now. I love this moment where he's like, don't take it off. They're not human. And he says, well, okay, come on. They're probably like magic in some way. But he's like, no, they're not human, guy.
Yeah. I love this other character. You do wish that he seems really capable. He seems like a gunslinger type,
Yeah.
Seems like the type who would have gone on well with Roland and been an asset. And it's a shame that this happens to him.
Yeah. I mean, we'll get to his death in a bit, but it is like just the tragedy of Roland Deschain that he meets these characters again and again that seem competent and good and he gets along with, and it's his curse that either they die or he leaves. He never just gets to actually hang out with these people.
Yeah. I do love this first interaction with them where they haven't had a chance to talk or touch base at all, but they still cover for each other or specifically he covers for Roland and in a way that's very smooth. It's just, it makes you, it's very tense and it also makes you really like him.
Yeah. We immediately like good old Norman.
Yeah.
Norman, who has a bad fate.
Yep.
So we don't know they're human, but what are they? Well, we're about to find out because later that night, Roland witnesses the little sisters drink the blood of that bearded man sitting across the tent. So they're vampires and it's just a vampire story. I want to talk about some of the language we hear here because at one point, one of the, I think it's Sister Mary, the lead vampire says the phrase, Condalak, me, him, and tow. And we've heard language similar to this before, right? In Wolves of the Calla, like we have the Canta, the Cantoi. We'll learn a little bit later that the Dr. Bugs, the official name of them, are the Cantam. So this is language we've heard some from the Manny and from the Lowmen, and I mean also from Stephen King's Desperation and Richard Bachman's The Regulators. That's kind of the origin of this kind of language came from those two books. But
okay, gotcha.
It's just fun to see all this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, hey, remember when you told me to ignore King's fake language stuff because it was nonsense? Because I remember that.
I mean, it is nonsense, Matt. I mean, it's just, in this case, it's nonsense that I think the book Desperation translates for us, so we know what it means. So,
I see. Okay.
So just so you know, Candelac means the heart of the unformed, and Me, Him, and Toe says our God is strong. So the heart of the unformed is basically their name for their whatever God they worship.
Gotcha.
Which, I mean, it's an interesting like primordial evilness, right? Not necessarily Toadash space, but not either.
Yeah, that's
some sort
cool.
of like some sort of evil that possibly predates the Crimson King, because they're not talking about the Crimson King here. This is something else.
Yeah, that's neat. It definitely a Lovecraft vibe.
Yeah.
But like you said, not specifically Toadash. Makes me this. I think I said this recently, but like I want to learn more about the greater Stephen King mythos, because right now I feel like I'm so like overdeveloped in my Dark Tower mythos that I just assume that everything is from Toadash or something, and it's like, no, I'm sure he has other things going on in his mythos.
Yeah, I mean, studying Stephen King's universe is so interesting because it's just so incredibly inconsistent at times.
Yeah.
Because he's just not concerned with it. Like, he loves linking things together, but he doesn't ever care to like make sure the links are consistent across links. So like, I'm going to link this book to two other books, but does that make those two books link to each other in any kind of interesting way? Maybe.
Yeah. Up to you.
Yeah. It's fun. It's world building. It's the kind of world building I enjoy, that is like, it's loose and you don't get bent on a shape about it if things don't line up perfectly. I like it.
Yeah.
But not everybody does.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to serve the story that you're telling at the moment.
Yes,
and
yes.
And it's not, I mean, it's all made up.
Mm-hmm.
It's all made up anyway. The question is whether you're having fun right now.
Yes, that is very true. All right. So as much as I'd like to skip over this next part, we can't, because we're professional analysts and it's part of our damn job. Because after the Little Sisters finish with the bearded man, they head over to Roland. And while the sigil that he wears protects him from death, doesn't stop them from giving him a good old-fashioned infirmary tent handjob. Because that is what happens here. So Roland discovered that not all of him was paralyzed after all. Part of him had, in fact, arisen from its sleep at the sound of their voices and now stood tall. A hand reached beneath the bed dress he wore, touched that stiffened member, encircled it, caressed it. He lay in silent horror, feigning sleep, as a wet warmth almost immediately spilled from him. The hand remained where it was for a moment, the thumb rubbing up and down the wilting shaft. Jesus, Stephen. Then it let him go and rose a little higher, found the wetness pooled on his lower belly, and then they eat it.
Uh-huh.
They eat the jizz.
Yep.
So we have to talk about this, Matt.
Yeah, of course. I'm sure this was probably one of the only jizz eating scenes in the entire anthology of Legends.
Do you think the editor of Legends got this and was like,
yeah, they're probably like, we were trying to make this like PG-13, Stephen.
Look, you said you wanted Stephen King, and I gave you Stephen fucking King. Yeah, the vampires jack off Roland and eat his jizz. They're jizz vampires. Deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it invites all sorts of interesting analysis, honestly.
I mean, in all seriousness, I think it is interesting. Like, once again, we have this recurring beat throughout the Dark Tower, and King puts it here in this story as well, of sex linked to demonic forces, right? Like, this is not the first time Roland's been manhandled by a demon. And it's not going to be the last either.
No, and there's a lot of demon fucking in this story. Yeah. I mean, I thought it was really interesting, for example, that the sisters can touch him. Mm-hmm. They're not prohibited from touching him. They just can't. They can do sexual stuff to him. Even they just can't harm him. And so it's like the magical protection of the amulet has this kind of ambiguity or kind of wrinkle to it, where like they can touch him, and there is the whole sex magic element that pervades the Dark Tower universe. And it's interesting to think about like this. I mean, it's definitely like a weird a weird, shocking sex thing, which is very Stephen King, but also it's just interesting because it's like, okay, they can't take his blood, but they can sexually stimulate him and get what they need from him that way. And it's like they feed on life, and they can get life out of a man by either killing him and eating him and drinking his blood, or having sex with him. It's and which kind of reminds me of Mia, actually, because she would fuck men to death as well. Yeah,
Detta. Well, Mia too. Yeah, no, you're right. You're right.
When she was
the
in her
demon Mia. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, demon magic and sex are intrinsically linked together in this story, and I mean, I think there is something specific to the fact that it's not just sex, right? This is non-consensual, right? They're basically raping him,
right?
And so there is something inherently evil about that, and so it's the power of the sigil, like, can't stop that part of it from happening, you know? Like it's really it's like so evil that it just overdoes that power, and yet it's really, I mean, it's certainly extremely weird, and it just comes out of nowhere 100%, but it's interesting. Like we had a listener way back when we started this, like, charting and tracking all the weird sex stuff in this book, and how evil and sex were wrapped in each other in certain ways. But here again, King looks at the story and says, okay, I'm going to tell a 60-page short story that basically encapsulates what the Dark Tower is. I got to include some demon sex.
Makes perfect sense.
Yep.
I mean, this story really wouldn't have worked without
it would not have. I mean, there is a part later in the story where, like, when Mary is basically telling Roland, you can't harm me, she's like, you'd have to get some holy water or holy blood or holy sperm, basically.
Right.
So, like, there's this idea that there is power in this stuff, that it represents something powerful, or can. And so that's why they're ingesting it, because there's life there, there's power there. And if it was blessed, if you blessed the jizz,
right,
then it would burn them as they ate him. So there we go, kids. Holy water, holy jizz. That's how you defeat a vampire.
Yep. That only
get it. I was gonna say, I could not finish the sentence, let a priest bless your penis, because it's awful.
We're crossing some lines now. But I mean, Stephen King is definitely the only person who can write this.
Yes.
And have it work.
It does work. Like, I mean, I like to read it out loud is certainly an experience.
Yeah.
And I, like, halfway through, I was like, I have to stop this, because, like, Stephen, he's one of a kind.
I mean, what's funny is I think I probably reacted quite strongly to that as, like, a teenager, and it was just
sure.
You know, what the fuck is this? But now I'm just like, yeah, of course.
Of course, they're fucking vampires. Of course they jacked him off.
Yeah, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
That's what the story is.
Jeez. All right, so chapter 5, Sister Mary, a message, a visit from Ralph, Norman's fate, Sister Mary again. This is great, because I think your first reaction is, who the fuck is Ralph? How are we going to get a guy named Ralph in this story? So Roland is awakened again the next morning, and Sister Mary is there to feed him the drugged soup once again. Their conversation eventually turns to Jenna, and we get this kind of establishing part here. Sister, if you and Jenna don't see eye to eye, why not release her from her vows and let her go her course? Such as us can never be released from our vows, nor be let go. Her mother tried and then came back, her dying and the girl sick. Why, it was we nursed Jenna back to health after her mother was nothing but dirt in the breeze that blows out towards Endworld. And how little she thanks us. Besides, she bears the dark bells, the sigil of our sisterhood, of our quartet. So once again, there we have another sigil, whatever. The dark bells represent something important to the sisters, and thus are granted power in the same way that the medallions are. So this beat keeps recurring and recurring.
Yeah, I like that. Also, I think this is, as far as I remember, the only mention of the word quartet in the story.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like, you think of quartet as like this. It again goes to show you the complexities of Ka, right? Because Ka is not a good thing. Because, like, you think of the quartet, it's like when the good buddies get together and they're all doing good stuff. But no, they have their own quartet. It's just bad and violating and gross.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to remember now if Jonas's coffin big coffin boys, as we call them, if they were ever referred
as the
to
book called them.
Yes, you're right. If they were ever referred to as a quartet in the text, I don't actually remember.
I don't remember either.
Yeah.
Possibly. I mean, it's not the first time quartet has been used by the enemies of the story.
Right. Yeah.
So later that night, Jenna slips Roland a package. It's a bunch of reed heads that give him a super burst of energy when he eats. So this is like part of how he'll counteract the drugged soup that they're giving him. She also says that she's going to help him escape the next night. And I once again want to return to how you felt about Jenna at this point in the story.
Yeah, still not sure. I mean, I really do feel King is continuing to keep it ambiguous. I think the fact that the reeds have these terrible side effects don't really help her case. On the other hand, they do seem to keep the poison at bay. But you get the sense that if he ate too much of it, he could die easily. So, but yeah, I think the ambiguity of it is what contributes to the tension, because it's a cat and mouse game between him and his captors, but a lot of his potential outs rely on Jenna, and since you're not sure if she can be trusted, that just makes you really nervous.
Yeah, and I think what adds to that is she's not really a presence in the story. Like, she comes at the very beginning, right? And then she's not seen again until the escape attempt, and like it's just like her whispering in his ear while he's sleeping,
right? And
just her touch, but her as a character is just not in the story very much, and so it pulls you into doubt every time.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things where you really could believe that she is actually like the mastermind, the head vampire,
which they're priming you for, because we're told like she's got the fancy bells that we know eventually will control the bugs, and it's like it seems like she's the head vampire. She's not. It again shows the meaning and the lack of meaning of sigils, right? That like she has the power, but also Sister Mary doesn't give a shit about that. She's the one in charge.
Yeah, that is interesting. How it's almost like she is supposed to be the head of the coven, but either refuses it, or maybe, I mean, it does seem like she's actually young. Like the fact that she's young is not a glamour.
No.
And that's part of the reason why she has such a low status.
Yeah. And I meant to talk about like perhaps why the other sisters' glamour is functioning so poorly. I think they're just starving to death, right? Like there's this really there's 3 humans left in this town basically, and 2 of them they couldn't eat because they were wearing the medallion, so they just they were probably rationing the bearded guy,
right?
And then so maybe like their magic isn't working as well because they're not eating enough.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't fully understand King's vampire mythos. I really want to read Salem's Lot for this reason.
Well, lucky you. You're gonna get to.
Hopefully someone will let me. Please, Scott. Why do you do this to me?
No, you're not allowed.
But I mean, I think that is also what occurred to me. The idea that they're just running out of, they're just dying basically. They're starving. Yeah.
So Roland has one last conversation with his neighbor Norman, who speaks of his home, Delane. I bring this up only because this is not the first time we've heard about this place, and it won't be the last, as Delane is actually the setting of another one of our season 2 novels called The Eye of the Dragon. So we're really hitting the season 2 beats in this final story here.
Awesome.
It was sometimes known jestingly as the Dragon's Lair or Lion's Heaven. All tall tales were said to originate in Delane. So should we believe the story that's going to be set there that we are about to learn? I don't know.
Yes.
But this is, I mean, a sad end for Norman, and King does the thing again where he has and that was the last time I ever talked to Norman.
Right. Yeah. Poor Norman and his throat. Anyway, moving on.
But I mean, going back to what you were talking about earlier, he basically, Roland promises, Norman asks Roland, hey, if you get out of this, please take my necklace and my brother's necklace back to my parents and tell my people what happened. And he's like, no, you'll get to do that yourself. And Norman says, no. Norman tried to raise his hand, perhaps to scratch his nose, and was unable to do that. The hand rose perhaps 6 inches, then fell back to the counterpane with a small thump. I think not. It's a pity for us to have run up against each other this way, I like you. And I you, John Norman. Would that we were better met. high when not in the company of such fascinating ladies. Like, this is sad. Like you were talking about earlier, this is sad that like these two people encounter each other. They like each other. They get along. They're both clever. They would be good traveling companions, but that's not the fate of people that know Roland.
Yeah, you're right. This is a little bit more of a subtle suggestion that Norman is about to die. Mm-hmm. It's almost like Norman is more kind of aware of what's going on than Roland is, even though he seems to be younger.
I mean, I think Norman like watched, like when he was put in this tent, there were a lot more people in there, and he's watched slowly, because like Norman is not like hanging from straps in the air being healed. He's fully healed. They just can't eat him. Yeah. So they're just keeping him in a bed and drugging him. And so he's just been around for a long, he's watched everyone else be slowly murdered. Yeah. And so he's given up. He knows the score.
That's a good point.
And no one's going to swoop in and save his life like Jenna does for Roland, because sorry, Norman, but Jenna was not that into you.
Yeah. You weren't to her taste, I guess.
So Norman dies that very night when the Little Sisters bring a green folk in to rip the sigil that protects him off his neck. This, by the way, is Ralph. And Ralph is the green man in the bowler hat that Roland saw way back in the city of Elluria. And I think it's a very Stephen King thing here, Matt, that he takes a lot of time characterizing Ralph here. Ralph is not just like a dude that they brought in to do this thing. Like, we spend time defining who he is and showing how he's afraid and being kind of bullied by these women, and how he kind of sort of outsmarts them by ripping Norman's throat out and then sprinting away.
Right.
Like, he could have just been a one-note character, but King takes a few pages in this very short story to like teach us who this person is. So it's Ralph. What did you think of Ralph?
I love Ralph. He's such a great monster. He's full of craftiness. He's not nearly as stupid as you assume he is. And he uses that to his advantage. It kind of reminds me of the goblins in Wild Bow's works, where he's just like delightfully awful.
Yeah It's good. And again, this is where King really excels, because like we didn't need this. The story didn't need this, but I think it's better for it. Yeah. We get this small couple page interaction where this guy outsmarts the Little Sisters. Yeah,
right. Once again, it's tense, because you actually begin to care about Ralph.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, like even though it's like, wait a minute, this is the guy who's a direct antagonist to Roland, and he also just murders poor Norman, but like you're kind of glad he gets away though, actually.
Yeah, a little bit. For everything that he does, a little bit. You're like, yeah.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe other people reacted differently, but I was like, I hate, at this point, I hate the Little Sisters so much.
Yeah.
That it makes me happy that Ralph pulled one over on them.
I do think it helps also demonstrate how they are kind of at their wits' end here, and it like helps try to set the stage for how Roland and Jenna are able to get one over on them, because they're desperate. And like, you can just imagine them like, we're starving to death. The only two people left we have are these ones that are wearing these necklaces. What are we going to do? And then someone's like, hire one of those green idiots.
Right.
And they're just, this guy who is clever, but not the smartest guy in the world, is able to get one over on them because they're desperate. And it like, we're kind of slowly starting to establish how these women that have had the power over Roland this entire time are actually totally ineffectual and shitty. They're just very used to having people at their very whim. Like, they take injured people, they nurse them back to health so they can eat them at their full strength and get the full strength of their life. And so they're just very used to not being challenged by anyone.
Right. Not having to negotiate.
Yeah.
There's definitely a vibe of, evil destroys itself here, because you feel like they could, if they had just treated Ralph fairly and like made a straight deal with him, they could have got exactly what they wanted. But like he rightly picked up that they were probably going to double cross him.
Yeah. For no reason other than they're evil. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why they, they only got one of the two, and then they all got, owned. So.
Yep. Speaking of getting owned, let's move on to our final chapter of the night.
All right.
This one titled Jenna, Sister Coquina, Tamra, Michelle, Louise, the Cross Dog, What Happened in the Sage. So our final chapter of the short story begins with Roland doing what Roland does best, thinking about the old times. Hey, remember in The Gunslinger where Roland was like, I didn't often think about the old times. Liar.
Except whenever I'm holding still.
This time in particular, the focus is, of course, Susan Delgado. He thought as always of Susan. If you love me, then love me, she'd said. And so he had.
And how?
So returning to our earlier conversation where we discussed that King kind of had the freedom here to introduce or reintroduce elements of Roland's character wherever he wanted to, he chooses again and again throughout the Little Sisters of Eluria, not just here, but many times, to reference Susan Delgado and Roland and his responsibility in her death. And so this is something he felt was important. I mean, interestingly enough, after our conversation last week, he doesn't talk at all about Roland's responsibility for his mother's death, about anything that happens there. He talks about Susan Delgado, and there's a reason for that, right? I mean, it's because this is a story about Jenna and his relationship with Jenna. And so establishing Roland's history with women and how that history doesn't go very well for him and especially doesn't go very well for them is pretty important to what the story is doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I agree. And also just the fact that throwing in the whole matricide thing into the middle of this little short story would be really disorienting.
Yeah.
To people who didn't know what the hell was happening.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even as it is, if you don't know who Susan Delgado is, then this beat doesn't quite fall fully for you. But I mean, you get the gist, though. I think.
Yeah, you get the plot elements. You don't get the emotion behind it. Like the line "If you love me, then love me" is one of the most beautiful and also devastating lines in the story.
Yeah, because
we know where that relationship ends. So like the emotion just doesn't land for you if you're reading this for the first time.
Right.
But I do wonder, I mean, I know you can't fully channel what 13-year-old Matt was reading this story. I do wonder how this story plays to someone who's read none of the books. I do think it's functional, but like emotionally, I just feel like it's just not going to do anything for you.
Well, I think it does pretty well for a short story, you know, like
sure.
Like I mean, I remember liking it. I'll say that. Like I remember liking it. And it stuck with me. I did remember it fairly well. I don't actually remember. I literally don't even remember what the Wheel of Time story from Legends was. And I was a Wheel of Time fan, so that seems like a problem. I think it was Moraine's backstory, but I'll check that later. But anyway, no, I think it worked on me. I mean, it's like I don't know. A short story is a tricky animal.
Sure.
There are some short stories that are life-changing and they rock you and they stick with you forever. But I think the vast majority of short stories are actually, you know, like this story or not as good as this story.
Is this the only King short story you read?
I don't think so. I'm sure I've read at least one other one.
Man.
But yeah, I don't know. Good question.
That's really, I mean, one day we'll have to maybe have a bonus podcast where we just talk about some King short stories. Cause like, you know, I love long form King, obviously. I love The Dark Tower. I love The Stand. I love it. But his short stories, he can be really, really good. He really uses the medium to its fullest effect and tells some really wonderful compressed stories. I love his short fiction so much.
It'd be fun to kind of run through like a best of King's short stories kind of.
Yeah, but that would require me to come up with a list of the best of, and that would be very difficult. Maybe we'll just farm that out to our listeners. Yeah. Listeners, send us your best of King's 10 best short stories. Go.
Yeah, thank you.
We have listeners to do these things for us. We don't have to do everything. I don't have to make choices. Choices are hard.
That's the nice thing about having listeners.
That's true. So speaking of women Roland loves definitely living full, complete lives, Jenna shows up. And she's got Roland's guns with her. And so this is the moment that we trigger Operation Get the Hell Out of This Tent. Jenna rings her black bells on her head, which we were told is a sigil of their quartet. But in this world, sigils are more than just things. They do have power if you attach power to them. And this sigil's power is to control the doctor bugs. And so Jenna sends them after Sister Coquina, and she is consumed by bugs. So at this point, what do we think the story's saying about sigils at this point? Like, it's this recurring motif. It's all over the place. We also saw it a lot with Father Callahan and everything he went through. What do you think, Matt? What's your opinion on this?
Well, I wrote in the script here, insert clever answer to your question here.
I saw that, so I assumed you came up with one.
I was hoping that I would figure something out between then and now. I don't know. I really don't. I mean, we've even got Maturin, the turtle, which serves as the sigil at various points in the story, which is, both represents and channels the power of the actual Maturin, I guess, which I guess itself represents the white. I think that it's, I don't want to be this simplistic about it, but part of me wants to say that there's like, there's the white, which is like the root of all magic, or all good magic, maybe. It gets confusing though, because the Crimson King definitely does magic. These bells are definitely magic. You could call everything about Toadash like a kind of magic, but it's like, so is it that there's a polarity where there's evil magic and then there's good magic, or there's many different poles. Maybe there's like, there's white magic, and then there's blood magic, and then there's sex magic, and then there's bug magic. Like I don't know. Again, I feel like I'm being reductive and kind of breaking everything down into like D&D classes, which I doubt is the way that King thinks about this. But the idea here being that like different sigils represent different sort of bases of power, bases of magical power and energy. I don't know. That was my riff.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, there is, we didn't talk about it, but there's a part earlier in the story where Roland asked Norman about the bells, and he's basically just like, it's just like a symbol, like it's meaning, like it. And so the reveal here is that the bells do more. Like, it's not just the ringing of a bell, it's these specific bells, and no one else in their tribe, in their group, has these things. It's something that's unique to her. It's she is the one that is controlling the bugs. And so like these are actual totems of power. It's interesting because like you said, the conclusion that Callahan reached was that the symbol itself is meaningless. It is the power invested in the symbol, was the conclusion of Callahan's story. And I wonder if this is, not that it's inconsistent, but it's King wrestling with a concept that he doesn't really firmly land on until the Dark Tower, when he reaches that conclusion with Callahan. And we see these things. I mean, you could say that like, why, like we talked about this, why do the medallions have the power to push back the vampires, to burn them when they touch them? Well, I mean, it has nothing to do with like, because Roland is wearing one that doesn't belong to him, right? So, and it almost seems specifically the vampires' belief in that they will hurt them. Like if these things are powered by belief, as is what Callahan concludes, then like the vampires' belief in their ability to do this is what's powering them a little bit here.
Yeah, like the fear of it.
Yeah,
I was thinking about this in context of the cross dog, because the cross dog was clearly not made by anyone, or like blessed by anyone. Like it just is a dog that happens to randomly have a cross. And so the fact that is at all potent does kind of suggest that it's the vampires themselves who are like afraid of that symbol.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the dog was not blessed by God, and therefore the reason why crosses are supposed to like push vampires back in vampire lore is because it's an item of God, and they hate God, and like they can't, they're beings of evil, and holiness reflects them. But the things around their necks, the medallions, are not crucifixes, right? It just says he of God, right? Like it's just
right.
It's a symbol that holiness is poured into via like someone just stenciled God onto a medallion, and then suddenly it rejects vampires. Like a dog just grows a cross symbol and suddenly it rejects vampires. Yeah, it's arbitrary and it seems to be connected to belief.
Yeah.
And in that vein, the bells themselves are only powerful because the bugs believe in them. Like, you know, like the bugs see those bells as the bells that we respond to.
Right. Yeah, sure. I like that. I like that. That seems like something. Sure.
Sure. There was your clever reply right there.
Yeah, I like that.
So the two escape the tent, which interestingly we see here looks like suddenly less vast and less amazing and less pure white of a pavilion. It's just like a shitty tiny tent with like 6 beds in it, and it's crappy. And so like not only was their faces a glamour, but like everything was a glamour.
Yeah, I love this bit. It's so gross. It makes you uncomfortable because it causes you to instantly think back on all the prior moments in the story and like, oh, what was really happening there? Kind of reminds me of in Needful Things, the artifacts that Gaunt gives to people turn out to actually be rotten and crappy like this.
Yeah, that's really good. Really good. I really like this moment as well. Roland realizes that he left the medallion of Norman on the ground and he promised he'd get it and return it to his people, which does he ever? I don't think he ever does that. Maybe it's another adventure he has that King hasn't written a short story for yet.
Probably.
But Jenna says, I picked it up off the floor. He didn't know which made him gladder, the sight of the medallion or the sight of it in her hand. It meant she wasn't like the others. Then, as if to dispel the notion before it got too firm a hold on him, she said, Take it, Roland. I can't hold it no more. And as he took it, he saw unmistakable marks of charring on her fingers. He took her hand and kissed each burn. Thank ye, Sai, she said, and he saw she was crying. Thank ye, dear. To be kissed so is lovely, worth every pain. I just feel so bad for this girl, right? Like, it's such a sad story. Like, she later tells the rest of the sisters that this was the moment that she truly fell in love with him and like why she agreed to damn herself, because like he saw my fingers were burned and he kissed them, and nobody had ever showed me that kindness before in my entire life. And that was worth knowing. Like you have to assume that from this moment on, she knows she's fucked and she knows she's not going to be with him. And like, she's just buying time until her death. Right.
Yeah.
But she does it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. She is a fascinating character. I want to kind of save up my spiel about her for a little bit. Sure.
So they run off and are confronted by Sister Mary, who is refusing to let them go. And I really like this point. She basically looks at Roland and says, your gun can't do anything to me. And this is what we were talking about a little bit earlier. Roland looked down and saw one of his guns was in his hand. He had no memory of drawing it. Unless it's been blessed or dipped in some sex wholly wet, blood, water, semen, it can't harm such as I, gunslinger, for I am more shade than substance, yet still equal to such as yourself for all that. She thought he would try shooting her anyway. He saw it in her eyes. Those shooters are all you have, her eyes said. Without him, you might as well be back in the tent we dreamed around ye, caught up in our slings and awaiting our pleasure. The shooters are all ye have. It's true.
Yeah. No, it's great. I mean, Roland, so speaking of the idea that this is kind of a story about Jenna, Roland is just kind of hilariously ineffective in this whole story, right?
He doesn't do anything. He lays around.
He gets beat down like a chump, and then he lays around the whole time. Mm-hmm. And like really is fairly inactive in terms of saving himself until Jenna shows up with his guns. Then his guns are ineffective and don't contribute anything. And then Jenna just saves him, and then they just escape because of Jenna and the dog.
And Jesus dog.
Jesus dog, right.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, that's the whole point is that Roland does nothing here at all.
Yeah.
Which is very unlike Roland.
Very unlike Roland. It strikes me as a kind of subversion of what you might expect in like a, young gunslinger comes to town type story.
Sure. It is very, very reminiscent of Drawing of the Three Roland, who was kind of ineffectual and dying throughout most of that story.
It's true. Yeah.
All right. So the Cantam don't attack Sister Mary, and Roland's guns are useless, and all seems lost until Jesus dog comes to the rescue. Black fur on white, the cross. It bears the sigil of Jesus man on its chest, and sigils have power. The dog defeats Mary, and Roland and Jenna escape thanks to our Deus Ex Jesus dog. And once again, like as we talked about earlier, this is his mercy saving his ass.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
So they run away together and have one beautiful night where they kiss, and then Roland doesn't go any further with her, actually, but he just kisses her and then falls asleep. And then Jenna, damned, is transformed into the Cantam. She becomes the bugs.
Yeah, or perhaps she always was the bugs. I mean, that's the thing where I'm not entirely clear. I do want to learn more about the king vampire concept, but I like what you said, where it's sort of like symbiotic or some kind of transformation, because I mean, she obviously was an individual, and when she transforms into the Cantam, there does seem to be some residual essence of her being, but you sort of get the sense that it's barely clinging on, and that it is dissipating, and then it's just going to be gone. Yeah,
I mean, it's one last moment where she like summons all the individuality she has to make a curl of hair for him to look at and just remember her. And then that bit, that Jenna is gone from that point. So yeah, it's interesting because you're right. I mean, Sister Mary, when Roland felt Sister Mary's skin, he felt crawling as if she was just like a bunch of bugs in an Edgar suit.
Yeah, exactly.
but Jenna did not seem that way. But we're told she's just like the rest, except a younger version of them. So maybe this is like at the evolution. I mean, I don't know how these vampires fit into our category. You know, we had Callahan gave us the category of 1s, 2s, and 3s of the vampires, and the Little Sisters don't seem to fit in those. They seem different, but they're still vampires, and they still, like, the bugs are the connection to the vampires from Wolves of the Calla. So I don't know. There's not a clear answer for us here. I think he was still kind of making up his mind on a lot of this. Yeah. I'm okay not knowing. It's creepy and Lovecraftian, and I don't always like solid answers when it comes to creepy mythological things of the night. I like them to remain a bit mysterious, so I'm fine with that. Yeah, I mean, like vampires, like there's so many different versions of the idea of a creature that sucks your life force away from you, you know? I mean, we've seen, like, we've had multiple kinds of vampires. Even Dandelo is a kind of vampire in this world. So it's true. They don't necessarily all have to link up to each other perfectly. Although now I remember that Dandelo did sort of like start to turn into a giant bug when he was breaking down his glamour. So yeah, that's true. What is it with bugs and vampires? Yeah. I mean, maybe that makes it like they are of Todash space. Yeah, that sounds right to me, at least. All right. All right, so we're near the end of the story here, and I just think the way the story ends is beautiful and haunting, and I just wanted to read some of it here. Roland sat down on the ground and put his hands over his face. He thought he might weep, but in time the urge passed. When he raised his head again, his eyes were as dry as the desert he would eventually come to, still following the trail of Walter, the man in black. If there's to be damnation, she had said, let it be of my choosing, not theirs. He knew a little about damnation himself, and he had an idea that the lessons, far from being done, were just beginning. I love this. I like the moment where he almost cries for her, but then doesn't. It's almost this threshold moment, right? Where Roland eventually transforms into a man with no heart, and part of the Dark Tower and part of his quartet is reteaching him how to love and feel and live. And so this is almost the first step towards this moment where he immediately smitten by this woman, falls in love with her very quickly. She saves his life. She sacrifices herself to save him. And he almost weeps for this lost love. And then the urge passes and he moves on. And to link it back, and King in this moment links him back to that version of himself that starts in the Gunslinger. His eyes were as dry as the desert he would eventually come to. That this is King drawing a link between this Roland and what he will become. And it's sad. You can see it happening in front of our eyes here. Yeah, I love that connection. That's absolutely right. This is a moment that hardens his heart just a little bit further. Maybe it makes him a little bit more into the kind of person who would have just shot the dog at the beginning. Yeah. That's great. And then the story ends with, he was alone in the low hill country west of Elluria, quite alone. And those are the last two words. The last two words of the story are quite alone. And as we talked about again and again in our journey through the final book, The Dark Tower, this idea of loneliness versus community, this idea of being around people and what people do for Roland and what loneliness does for Roland and how that's reflected in Mordred. It's so important to his transformation. And so that is what is emphasized as we leave the story. Quite alone.
Yeah.
That's Roland. Roland at his worst is Roland who is alone.
Yeah. I mean, at least he had a horse when he started out.
Yeah. I love that there's this little bit like, maybe he'll find a mule too. That's just King winking at you.
Right.
He starts the gunslinger with a mule.
That's great. But yeah, just to wrap up the notion of talking about this being Jenna's actual story, like she might actually be the protagonist. I'm not totally sure.
I like that
because she doesn't fit quite comfortably as the protagonist, but Roland, I don't think has much of an arc. So why not? It's fine. In a short story, you don't need to think of arcs in the same way as you do in novels. But yeah, like she's this creature. She's kind of like Mia, where she's like a creature of darkness. She's monstrous. She's something maybe Todash adjacent. We don't know exactly. It doesn't really matter exactly, but she does remind me of Mia in that she's not purely evil. She doesn't want to feed on innocent people. We don't even learn why, right? We don't learn what made her not want to feed on people. We don't learn where she comes from, or we know she has a mother. Like, that's interesting, right?
Yeah.
The very fact that she has a mother seems very sort of contradictory to the whole notion of how vampires work. But she doesn't want to. She doesn't want to eat people. Her mother also seems to not want to eat people. We don't know why that is either. But like, we don't need to know that. But it's just interesting to think about, to consider who she is and where she comes from, and the idea of this basically vampire creature who is damned in the sense that she dies, but also maybe this was the only way that she could be redeemed.
Yeah. Damned in her own way, her own choice. I think I love it, because you're right. Like, we get so little of her, but there's a lot you can fill in. Like, all we know is that her mom, they tried to escape from this whole thing, right? They tried to escape. They tried to get away, and they found that they couldn't. Just like the bugs seem to not like to go too far away from each other, they couldn't escape from this. They were drawn back. Like, her mother was dying and she was sick, so they tried to live an existence away from doing this to people, and were kind of forced to come back to it. And there's tragedy in that. Like, you can't dismiss your vows. You just have to deal with it. Yeah.
I read that as basically just they were starving, and they returned trying to get food. Yeah.
And her mother was so far gone that she couldn't be healed. So she just died. Right. She starved to death.
Right.
It's sad. It's very sad.
Yep.
All right. So that is The Little Sisters of Eluria, a fun little short story. I really enjoyed visiting that one. I'm glad we got to do it as part of this.
Me too.
But Matt, that's it. That's the last we're going to read of Roland Deschain.
The last.
That's it.
I feel like we've said that every week for like 6 weeks, but yeah.
But it's true.
It's finally true for realsies.
Yeah.
And then, until the movie.
Well, yeah, but look, okay. That's the last we're going to get to talk about Roland Deschain.
I see.
Not
Fred. Frank.
Fred Deschain.
Yeah, right.
I love Idris Elba's take on the character, but we'll get to that. Okay. We got a whole episode to deal with that.
All right.
Before we go, though, we did ask folks what they thought of Little Sisters of Eluria. We didn't get a lot of answers to this question, I think because a lot of our listeners have not read the story. I had a few listeners that said, I've never read this book, so I'm reading it with y'all for the first time, which is cool. That's exciting.
Yeah.
But it also wasn't like a super creative question, so maybe that's why some people, what did you think of it? You like? We did get some answers, though, and they were pretty good. So we'll go through those.
All right. So from Pedro Achilles, we have, I've always loved Little Sisters of Eluria. It is the quintessential Dark Tower story. You have the Western elements of the gunslinger riding in the town, the horror of the sisters themselves, a hint of romance with the Roland-Jenna relationship, her tragic fate, slow mutants, sex stuff, and most importantly, Popkins. We forgot about the Popkins, Scott.
We didn't talk about the Popkins.
Yeah. Really, all that's missing is a crazy robot or two. I love the character of Roland at this stage in his life. He's left his boyhood behind, but hasn't yet been consumed by the coldness that will define him in The Gunslinger. He gives the slow mutant several warning shots, which is a lot more than the older, even more jaded Roland would have done. My favorite aspect of the story is that Roland gets very few opportunities to be heroic. First, he's injured and spends most of the story recovering from his injuries, watching helplessly as the sisters pick off the survivors around him. He only escapes with the aid of Sister Jenna, who does most of the work, as Roland's guns are basically useless in that situation. It's a side of Roland we haven't really seen since the drawing of the three. Wow, Pedro Achilles, you summed up in like 2 paragraphs what it took Scott and I 2 hours to get through. You want to just take over for us?
Yeah, just come on and just take over the podcast.
Yeah.
I really liked Pedro's kind of tongue-in-cheek pointing out that there's no robot stuff in here. And that's an interesting choice, right? Like, if you were trying to sum up Dark Tower in a short story, you would think some kind of anachronistic mix of Western and technology would be part of what you would do. And he leaves that part out of the story.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Yeah, I wonder if maybe he just thought it would be a bit too much and a bit too chaotic for a short story. But I agree. Yeah. I think if you'd asked me beforehand, I might have guessed that there was a robot in here somewhere.
Yeah. Maybe in one version of the draft there was, and then the editor of Legends was like, no.
Yeah. Maybe they were like, look, King, you can either have the jacking off scene or the robot scene, or the robot jacking off scene.
He made the right decision. Right. Up next, we have Pear Jane, who says, Sisters reminded me of my first audiobooks ever, back in 1995, the Star Wars Thawne trilogy, which I listened to during the boringest temp job ever. Reading further adventures is like reuniting with your friends. You slip back into the same rhythms and jokes, and sometimes you learn something new. So Little Sisters is the gunslinger, except the mule is a horse, and the toll folks are slow mutants, and Jake's already dead, but he comes back to life when Roland wakes up in Rivendell, except the elves are vampire nuns who control healing nanobot bugs. Also, it ends with the doggy ex machina, and the nugs are also nanobite bugs. TLDR, 2.5 hours of well-spent audiobook for me, but probably a big WTF for anyone who isn't a tower junkie, and that suits me fine.
That's great.
That was a very good summary of what took us 2 hours to do as well.
Yeah. Wow. Feeling a little overwhelmed. All right, and then a final answer from Steve D. Cy King so rarely disappoints with his short stories. I think he had a unique vampire idea, but didn't want to rewrite a lot of vampire lore already established in Salem's Lot. He recently completed a young Roland story in Wizarding Glass. King has a great character, but was not ready to advance him on his quest. Why not play out his new vampire idea with a character who already has his own universe and abuse him some more? Well, that's a very functional sort of believable assessment of why this book was written.
Yeah, no, I'm into it. He also, like, there are connections with some of it. Maybe we'll circle back to some of what he says for the inspiration for the story, because some of it comes from The Talisman, which is another book we're going to be reading in our next season. So
cool.
We can circle back around to that.
Awesome.
But that is it for us here this week. Oh, next week, it's movie time, folks. I've been waiting for this since we started. Everyone, go watch the movie. You'll have a great time. Go watch the movie and report back next week. Matt, I am curious, as we move into the movie, something that some of our listeners have been dreading for a while now. What is your expectation at this point? What do you think you're going to see here?
I mean, I think that they're going to make it an action movie.
Okay.
I think they're going to make it an action movie. I mean, I kind of know certain things. Like, we don't get Eddie and Susanna.
Yes.
We have Jake. We have Roland. We have a Man in Black take that I don't think I'm going to like, even though I love Matthew McConaughey, honestly. I don't know what they're doing, honestly, because I don't know how much of the story we're getting. I don't know if this purports to be a Dark Tower movie or like, I don't know what this is, actually. I guess I should admit that I'm fairly uncertain. Like, I've seen the trailer and it looks nothing like anything from the books. So I'm just like, they must have just kind of thrown the books in the trash and just done their own thing. That's all I can say for now. I really don't know.
Okay, cool. Well, we will check back next week and talk all about it. I'm excited. I have not watched this movie since I saw it in theaters when it came out. I have not watched it, not watched a bit of it. I guess that's not true, because sometimes I'll put on a YouTube clip of Idris Elba saying the Gunslinger Creed, because I love it so much. But that's it. That's the only bit of it I've watched since I saw it. So it'll be me revisiting it for the first time in a long time too, and I'm excited. It's like, I think we're not gonna like it. No one that loves The Dark Tower liked this movie. I shouldn't say no one. I'm sure there's someone, but I think it's going to be a good time really diving into it. I did not read the series before I saw the movie in theaters, so I did not have The Dark Tower as a series super fresh on my mind. So I'm interested to see the ways in which it pisses me off even more when I have the series very, very, very fresh on my mind.
Yeah, sure.
It's going to be fun.
Sounds
it's going to be a good time. So join us next week for the movie.
And remember, you can reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod. And you can head on over to the subreddit, reddit.com/r/doofmedia, and tell us how much you hate the movie, or maybe you love the movie. I don't know. Just tell us.
Here's a fun activity. Pretend you had to write a 5-star review of the movie. What would that be like?
Yeah. That's fun.
Of course, if you're not already subscribed to Kingslingers, we really strongly recommend you do so and never miss an episode. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and everywhere. We're everywhere. We're in your ears.
Yeah.
We're on your smartphones. We're in your devices. You can probably play us out of a smart light bulb.
Yeah. Maybe your fridge.
Oh yeah, your fridge can definitely play my voice.
If we're not somewhere, then we should be.
Yeah. Tell us and we'll find a way to get there.
Right. If you like this show and you want to support it, then please consider donating at patreon.com/doofmedia. Speaking of which, we have new patrons this week. Russ S., Derek I., and Earl. Welcome. We hope you enjoy the cool stuff we have on the Patreon. We hope you enjoy our now, what is it, like you said earlier, 6 or so episodes where we cover Stephen King adaptations.
Yes. Yeah. We got so much fun content over there, whether at any level you're at. So please come check it out and help us. We really appreciate those that support us. It really means a lot to us.
Yeah.
But if you cannot afford to donate, that is absolutely okay. You can help us out by sharing this podcast on Twitter, on Instagram. We're on Instagram. Follow us on Instagram and share our posts. That helps, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Also, you can help us by leaving us a rating and a review. This week's Spotlight review comes from Carolyn's iPhone 6 Plus, who gives us 5 stars and says, "I love their viewpoint. I'm listening to their conversations as I read The Dark Tower again. I really enjoy hearing from a newbie in addition to a more experienced constant reader." Well, thank you so much, Carolyn's sentient iPhone 6. That was very kind of you.
Yeah, that is very sweet. Short and sweet. Love it.
Love it. All right, folks, that is it for us this week. We will see you back here next week for the movie. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.